Hi guys, I get a lot of questions on Instagram Q&As, usually from high school pitchers who are asking, how can I increase my shoulder external rotation? The first thing you have to think about is that in many cases, that request is based on something they saw in a still frame. So they looked at a side profile, it's a right-handed pitcher, a picture that was taken from the third base angle, and maybe they're not laying their arm back enough. What we often see with young pitchers, and really pitchers in general, is a lot of times they'll chase early arm speed in their delivery. So they'll be really aggressive early on, and in many cases it just leads to a pattern where they actually don't set their torso up into a good position to allow that layback to occur. So the first thing they're always looking at is there a mechanical fix, meaning is the lower half driving bad direction, or is the glove side yanking really aggressively? All these things that can make it hard to tap into the external rotation you really have. What we actually realize when we look at most throwers, and Paul's going to be a great example, is they actually have tons of passive external rotation. We're actually measuring him at the end of the season, so this is usually the most his external rotation would be. You realize I'm not even pulling him back at all, and he's already sitting at a cool 115, and even if I just take him a little bit further, he's substantially further back, probably closer to 130-ish, all right? And that's something that's acquired. It's called retroversion. It's a little bit of a warping of the growth plate that allows for more layback in the delivery. So most pitchers have tons and tons of passive motion that they need to just learn how to tap into. So in many cases, it's not just a stretch. And in many cases, if you do that, you're actually gonna make it worse because you can overstretch some of the ligamentous structures in the front of your shoulder. You can irritate nerves, you can beat up on a biceps tendon. So be careful about aggressive stretching into horizontal abduction or external rotation. But what you do wanna look at, we're gonna have Paul roll over on his stomach, is we want to see how much of that external rotation you can actively recruit, right? So we have passive range of motion, and then we have active control of it. So I'm gonna slide a little bit to your left. And what we'll do is we'll just support the humeral head, and all I want him to do is pretend there's a rod going right through his elbow, and I want to see how much of that external rotation he can actually tap into. And you realize there's not a big scapular compensation taking place. In reality, he's probably up here at a good 110, 115. So he's able to pick up the majority of his external rotation actively. And you're gonna find this in just about every pattern in your body, whether it's a straight leg raise or internal rotation. There's always gonna be a little lag between what you have passively and what you have actively. So for him, he's in a good spot. We wanna continue to preserve more and more of that active control of his passive range of motion. Okay, lay on your back one more time. Building on this though, is there are times when you have someone who does have a true limitation to external rotation. They jump in and, you know, for some reason on the left side they have 100 degrees and on the right there's also 100. You'd expect to have more on a throwing shoulder. My rule of thumb is we don't chase external rotation first. Instead, we look first at what's going on centrally, right? So is there limitations to thoracic extension? They have a hard time posteriorly tilting their scapula. But one that's really, really overlooked is looking at shoulder flexion first. So if we stabilize the scapula and then check shoulder flexion, for a guy like Paul, he's probably a minus 15 degrees, which is not out of the ordinary, particularly after a long season, right? Throwing a baseball is a very lat dominant activity, so you'll actually see people that get really gritty through their lats and they lose shoulder flexion. We know that there's several things that can limit your ability to get overhead, right? It can be a lack of thoracic extension. It can be an inability to posteriorly tilt the scapula because pec minor or coracobrachialis, some of those muscles are pulling you forward. We also know that we have things that cross the glenohumeral joint that can limit it. So lat, long head of triceps, teres major. We know that teres major and lat are both internal rotators of the humerus. So if you theoretically just kind of take your functional anatomy background, if you were to get some tissue extensibility changes through lat and through teres major to allow for more shoulder flexion, you're usually going to get some some more passive external rotation range of motion. So I always look first at what that shoulder flexion looks like before we start chasing modalities into external rotation. We also know that asymmetrical shoulder flexion tends to increase your risk of elbow injury in the season that follows when we've done those in preseason spring training measurements. The reason is very simple. If you can't get clean external rotation of your shoulder, you're often going to go to your elbow to kind of find that motion. So take home points, make sure mechanically you're sound so you can actually tap in to the external rotation you have. Next, check it out passively, see if it's actually limited. If it's not, go and chase active range of motion into external rotation. And if it is, look to shoulder flexion first and you're probably going to see some pretty pronounced changes quickly.